So welcome back to our third in the Theory of Training series. So on the first episode of Theory of Training, we ran through managing your resources in general, so as any form of athlete, just a broad concept of how you should approach any athletic endeavour, any endeavour that uses energy, and how you should kind of manage those. Last week we moved on to one of our kind of 4 categories. We talked about CrossFit and how you manage those, so if you're a CrossFitter, definitely go back and check those out. This week we're moving on to our real athletes. So if you're kind of an avid podcast listener, you will have heard us talk about real athletes a lot. So what we mean by real athletes is not so much a dig at people, but rather it's just a way of us of kind of bracketing off the clientele we interact with in our audience. So we have our powerlifters, weightlifters and CrossFitters, and they're our gym-based athletes. And then our real athletes are people who are everything else, basically athletics, track and field, rugby, wrestling, grappling, jiu-jitsu, any other sport you can think of are kind of our non-gym based, non-kind of strength based athletes. And today's episode is on kind of, it'll be more specific towards how real athletes can kind of manage their training overall. So not so much the specifics of the exact sessions, but rather a broad concept of how they should do that. So
what we're going to look at, the first thing I suppose is just defining each of their kind of phases of training. So in any sport you have, the actual sport you're doing will bring about some sort of adaptation. So if you're a soccer player, just going out and playing soccer matches will bring about adaptation. It will make you faster, it might make you stronger, it'll bring about like positive physiological adaptation. So that's one form of training. The second form of training then is sport specific training. So for a lot of athletes listening to this, or like real athletes, won't really have control over the sport, like how much they do it, but when they do it, they usually won't have control over their sport specific training, unless you're a coach who's listening to this. And then the third one is our auxiliary work. So it's our training in the gym, it might be our kind of skills training we're doing on the side, but it's non-sport specific training. Now, there's no reason to say that we can't make our non-sport specific training more and more applicable to our sport. But in general, this is the area where a kind of field sports athlete or a team sports athlete will have a lot more control over it. And this is probably where we're going to focus most of this today.
So the most overriding concept for anyone who's a real athlete to understand when you're managing resources and thinking about how you're going about your training is that your sport is the number one priority. So our sport overrides everything, by far and away the most important thing. So the only time where a sport wouldn't be number one is if you are rehabbing from an injury. So that obviously takes precedence, and training through injury is obviously a terrible idea. So when you're rehabbing, that's the only scenario where your sport overrides your sport is not number one. So any other scenario, you're always thinking about how will these actions affect my resources available to play my sport. Now there is definitely times, and we'll get into that in a little bit, when you can, for example, the off-season, when you can take away from your resources to knowing that you're going to negatively affect your sport and you're going to lose some kind of capability at your sport, to later on take more steps ahead. So you're taking 2 or 3 steps back to step forward. But for the vast majority of the time, your sport is the number one priority, and that's how all of your decisions are based off of how will this affect my sport? Will it negatively affect my performance? Will it improve my performance eventually? Short term, long term, so everything needs to be thought about in that way. So that's the most important thing.
Yeah, like the whole thing with this video series is it's these kind of decisions and the things we talk about, it's like a form of juggling. You're taking from one thing, putting it into the other. Today, like if you really just take away the one thing from this video will be that like you have the choice to kind of pick these adaptations you're going for, and you have the ability to kind of manipulate these things very slightly. Like as athletes who are involved with teams, or athletes who are involved in kind of leagues, or basically like larger sporting structures, you have very little control over what you do with your training. Even if you're self-coached and you're kind of self-managed and all this, or if you're in a position of, like if you're a captain or a vice captain of a team and you've some input over the training, you still don't dictate when you compete. You still don't dictate who you're competing against. Like all these things are very, very closed off and refined. So this is an area where you can get some autonomy and kind of grasp a lot of that control back.
So the best way to take control of your training, so like Darren was saying, you can't control your sports activity, so the actual sport you're playing. These are too many variables involved in this. You can't control competition. But when you have the best control for basically all of our real athletes is the off season. Okay, so the off season is the time when you can effectively put into into action all of your own plans that give you the biggest kind of benefits. Okay, so in the off season, we may have someone like a rugby player. So the rugby player may have finished up the season. He'll talk to his coach, and the coach will say, you need to gain 5 kilos of body weight, maybe 10 kilos, and then you'll put into action. You'll set out a plan, and you'll figure out how are you going to gain those 5 kilo body weight, what do you need to do, and then you're going to figure out that, and that's going to be your kind of overall plan. Okay, so when you figure out your overall goal, you're going to break it down into our kind of different headings. So we had our sport, so our sport is gone now that we're in the off season, so we're left with our sport specific training, and then we have our our gym work. Okay, so then you're going to figure out what you're going to do in your gym work, and then you're going to figure out what you're going to do in your sport specific work.
Yeah, I think these kind of decisions are always better if we take, like, rather than going, if you're starting an off season now, or if you're like a lot of people definitely over this side of the pond, they're going to be in an off season now, and because of the situation at the moment, people will have been already in an off season for maybe 12 weeks. What we have now is we've like a condensed off season where we have access to coaches, we have access to facilities. What I'm going to say is, if you took a week, not like 3 days, rather than just going straight back into training, make a really, really good plan of how you're going to put these resources around. So you're probably going to have restricted time with your coaching staff or with your team. So don't be fucking around by just going ham in the gym, or doing all these long runs that you might necessarily not need to do. Don't run straight back into a training facility like the gym or whatever and just go back doing your old program that you were doing before. Take 5% of that time. Sit down, write things out, have a conversation with people you might play with, have a conversation with people you've trained with in the past, with coaches, with old coaches, with new coaches. Ask the questions, make your plan. And that's like, if you're taking one thing away from this video, it's that like, you are in charge of dividing up your resources. You might have to go and do a total of 4 hours of teamwork a week. You're responsible for everything else that happens in the week. Just take your time now and say, where am I going to put these resources? If it was me, the first thing I'll look for the things you can change in season. So for most athletes, and especially like younger athletes, so if you take athletes under the age of 23 or 24, changes in body mass are going to be incredibly difficult to implement in season. So it's just the nature of most sports. We're not going to have a huge amount of kind of energy surplus, like especially if you're trying to gain a significant amount, or like in any amount of muscle mass. It's going to be very, very difficult when you have high energy outputs from a sport, and high energy outputs in a way are in kind of areas of stimulus that aren't ideal for putting on muscle. So like high energy output in your kind of low capacity, long duration work stuff. So longer runs, being on the pitch for an hour, being on the pitch for 2 hours every night. So definitely look at things that you can change in season and try and change them now while you have a chance. There might be things that you could very easily go after and attack in season. So those things might be really good ball handling skills. They might be really good like racket technique, or it might be really good kind of game specific play. You can do all those things in season. They don't take a lot of energy. They don't take a huge amount of like valuable times. You might be able to do them in the morning rather than being able to do them between 5 and 7 p.m. when a facility was open or whatever. So look at the things that you're not going to be able to implement in season. Try and get them done in your off season, and then titrate everything else around that.
So if you look at your volume overall, so you want to look at, when you're an athlete, you want to look at your whole year as opposed to kind of macro cycles. So in weightlifting, we might look at like maybe 2 to 3 months or next competition. But when you're like a real athlete, let's say you look at a 12-month period, and you'll accumulate an awful lot of fatigue in your on season. Okay, and so one of the most important aspects is letting that fatigue dissipate. Okay, so you're going to have a lot of issues. You're going to have a lot of competitive strain issues. So if you're running all the time, you're going to build up a lot of systemic fatigue from like high volume running. You're playing a lot of games, psychological. You're going to have a lot of stress built up from that. your muscles, tendons, ligaments, all those are going to take a huge beating, especially if you're running, if you're grappling, if you're wrestling. You're going to have a lot of systemic fatigue that you're going to need to let dissipate, and this kind of fatigue doesn't dissipate over the course of 2 to 3 days. This kind of stuff takes maybe 3-4 months sometimes to dissipate. Okay, so you want to look at your resources. You want to look at this as a time to dissipate this fatigue, and then be ready for a fantastic on season when you get into that next season. So you want to direct your energies into a productive way, but that is not affecting the same systems that you heavily fatigued in the on season. So if you're you shouldn't be coming into your off season, for example, having done a lot of running in your on season due to your sport specific activities. You shouldn't be looking to do a lot more running. You should be willing to kind of let go some of your performance, so you know that your performance is going to dip a significant amount. It could dip up to half, say, if you're looking at a percentage. You know that you could be a lot worse at your sport for a short time, but you should be very confident in your ability to regain this very fast, okay? And if you approach your off season in a very productive way, you know you'll come back and you'll be at 110% of your previous performance. So you should be looking at each off season as a kind of a stepwise improvement. So you should be looking at off season 1, 2, 3 and 4, so over the next 4 to 5 years, and you should be looking for improvements across all of these off seasons. You should know that your performance in your off season kind of goals should be increasing. So let's say we'll just pick something very simple again. We'll pick, say, with a rugby player who wants to back squat 200 kilos or high bar or high box squat, whatever it is. So you'll know next season, off season number 2, I'm going to do 220. Off season number 4, I'm going to be doing 235. And then you'll have picked these because these will drive your performance in your on season. So when you've picked these valuable kind of performance indicators, you'll aim to improve these off season. So you're going to be very meticulous. You want to be as smart as possible. So you'll pick them again. So just go over it. So they're not going to fatigue your systems that you use in the on season. You know that they positively affect your performance, and psychologically you enjoy doing them, which is very important. And then you're going to look to improve these, and you're going to figure out a way of improving these from each off season. So then hopefully your on-season performance is better each on-season.
Yeah, and then to move on, if we spoke about dividing your resources in the off-season, dividing your resources in the on-season, then it's a small bit more of a high priority item, because if I mess up my priorities in the off-season, it doesn't really affect me. So it doesn't really affect me as a hammer thrower or whatever sport you play, a tiddlywinks player. It'll affect you in the way that you won't make as much progress as you could have. If you mess up your allocation of resources on season, so in season, I have a game today, I have a week of training, and then I have a game again next weekend. If I mess up and I put too much resources into sprinting drills during the week, and I go too hard at sprinting, I don't put enough resources into my recovery work, I don't put enough resources into my sport specific work in season, that's going to have a real tangible and quantifiable effect, negative effect on me as an athlete. So I think in season things become a bit more complicated, and that's why if you really practice in your off season, off season is a great time to get work done, it's a great time to become a better athlete. This is one of these things of becoming a better athlete, of saying I'm going to practice allocation of resources now off season. So when I get in season, I know that I can pull this session.
Yeah.
I know that if Gerf is a soccer player and he's played a game at the weekend and he's supposed to have a squad gym session on a Monday, but he knows himself by the feeling of his body that this doesn't feel good, I'm just going to pull that session. It's not a big deal. The session isn't hugely important to the overall structure of our training program or whatever. That's a skill in itself, and it's something the more you practice, the better you get at it. And by all means, you should be practicing it now, and then by the time September comes or whenever your season starts, you'll be much, much better at it.
I was touching your hands till you stopped banging the table, and I kept banging it as well.
Yeah.
So when we get to the on season, you want to, Fitz touched there, you don't want to be looking to improve these performance indicators that you use in the off season. So you shouldn't be looking to improve, and I think people do make this mistake. So let's take the back squat again, because it's very simple to kind of conceptualize. So you shouldn't be looking in your on season to even maintain the actual 1RM, so you just want to maintain the benefits. So let's say in the off season you were squatting 2 times a week, okay, or 3 times a week or whatever. So when you get to the on season, you shouldn't be looking to maintain that specific number that you hit. You just want to maintain the benefits of that number. So you might hit 235 and you'll always have hit these kind of, you'll maintain those adaptations that you hit, even though you might be able to hit that number at any given time. So you have peaked to hit it, but you'll have kept those benefits, those useful benefits, and you should be able to figure out after a while that you'll know that I can do 190 for, let's say, a double maybe once every 2 weeks, and if you still feel strong doing that, and that'll help you keep those benefits, but you know that it doesn't negatively impact your actual sport. So when we're on season, we're never looking to improve these other aspects. We're looking to just maintain some gains if possible to improve our sport.
That's a really good point. We use performance indicators all the time in an off season, and then we tend to say we keep using off season performance indicators to monitor our performance in season. Like, your performance in season is winning games or losing games, or it's coming first in a race or coming second in a race.
Or choking someone.
Yeah, it's like losing a fight or getting choked out. So if, like, key performance indicators are very, very important off season, and they're very important in season, but we need to alter what we're looking at. So if the classic thing I always think about is a body weight shift. So I'm like a 23-year-old rugby player. I'm looking to put on 5 to 8 kilos in an off season because I'll be more impactful when I hit someone. So just take that example. So I go from 100 kilos to 108 kilos. All my other metrics are the same. So I've good sprint times, I have good strength numbers, I have good conditioning and ability to last the length of a game. But when I hit someone, I'm much more impactful when I hit someone. You're not, like, through the nature of sport, without certain things, you're probably not going to be able to maintain that continual body mass over the course of a season. Definitely over the course of going from an off season to a pre-season training block, which tends to be like fucking fat camp for a lot of coaches who don't really understand physiology. But that, like, you can't maintain those increases in body mass, and like, you're not looking to maintain increases in body mass. You're looking to maintain the effectiveness of those physiological changes. So if I'm able to then go into a tackle and I might only have a net increase of 3.5 kilos, but I'm way more impactful in a tackle, that's the important thing to note.
So that actually touches on a great point, is that you can use these on-season or off-season performance indicators as our indicators of fatigue in our off-season. Okay, so let's take the back squat again because it's a simple one. Let's say you know that every 2 weeks, without putting a lot of effort into your squat, you can hit 190 for a double.
You mean an indicator of fatigue in your on-season?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So an indicator of your fatigue in your on-season. So let's say you can hit 190 for a double every 2 weeks, no problem, usually in on-season, okay? But by month 4 of your on-season, 170 is starting to feel real heavy, and you know you can normally hit this, and then in the on-season you've done like 220, let's say. So you want to pick things that are good indicators of fatigue, and you may need to sacrifice your kind of performance. Let's say you're playing, so there'll be a couple of different things like this, okay? And you'll as you progress as an athlete, you'll learn. As you grow as an athlete, you learn how you feel as fatigue, okay? So you may come points where, let's say that 170 is starting to feel heavy, and you think, Jesus, there's been a lot of games I've been playing recently. It might be time to talk to your coach and say, if you're playing a field sport or whatever, is to sit out a game or two. Now this may not be something you want to do, and let's say you're coming up to a final, you have to, or whatever, championship match or whatever, league game, something like that, something important. You may then have to make the decision that you're willing to sacrifice potentially injury and accumulating more fatigue for your winning or losing, okay? But if you're far from the end of the league, there's nothing important coming up, let's say you've lost a lot of games, it might be time to be intelligent, so let your ego go a little bit and say, look, can I sit out the next 2 or 3 games? You may have some fights coming up. It might be smart to say, look, I don't think I can take this fight, I'm too fatigued. Especially in something like fighting as well, so not only could you get injured in your training, you may also end up with like brain damage, concussion, like you could physically damage yourself. So
this is worst case scenario.
Yeah.
This is, you've been an idiot, your coach has been an idiot, and the system you're playing within has been very poorly managed.
And this
happens so much. Very few athletes go through a whole season where they don't feel like they've had 4 or 5 games. So like, if you're looking at 10% of games where you don't feel great going into it, you're in a very poorly managed setup.
Yeah.
And that's your fault directly, It's the fault of a coaching setup, and then it's the fault of whatever league or whatever competitive structure you're playing within. This is why these things are important.
Yeah.
Like, you can take some control and you can manage, like, I'm going to go to bed an hour earlier every night. I'm going to eat 700 more calories. I'm not going to go drinking. I'm not, like, there's loads of things you can do.
Yeah.
Like, if you're talking about missing a game, this is where everything has gone wrong.
Yeah.
You've pulled the chute of the paracord, or you've pulled the parachute cord,
Yeah.
and nothing has come out, and now you're onto the reserve one. Like, missing games, missing competitive outlets is the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
And that's why this is important.
So, for example, a lot of like teams in GA in Ireland will use like a GPS to measure the kind of total volume of running that they've done in a week, you know, and that's kind of an example of one of the variables. Now, you can't control what your coach makes you do, and if your coach makes you do this running, you may need to keep doing this running to keep your position on the team, you know, and this happens in worldwide, you know, the perception, like I mentioned, coaches don't and now we're not ragging on coaches, there's obviously thousands of great coaches out there, but there's just as many shit coaches, you know, and they are putting their athletes in a position where they're going to get injured, so it's up to you, it's your responsibility to manage this fatigue as much as possible outside of these sessions, okay? So you can't change the coaching management, but you can change your actions that you go about. So you need to figure out your kind of performance indicators, your kind of in off season they're not really performance indicators, they're more fatigue indicators, because you know you're definitely going to be fatigued by the end of your season, and as the season on season. So as the on season goes on, you know the fatigue is going to accumulate. There's nothing you can do about that. So by the nature of your sports, you'll almost certainly be fatigued, and by the end you'll be at your maximum fatigue, okay? So it's up to you to manage that as best as you possibly can, and use these indicators to kind of gauge your levels of fatigue and figure out what you can do.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that was pretty good. We got a lot of, so obviously there's literally so much more we could talk about, but that's kind of a broad concept, I suppose, of what you can do.
One thing that would be great for us is if you just let us know what you want more detail on.
Oh yeah.
That always helps. Like these theory of training videos came from people messaging us and commenting on videos asking us to do this. Last week's one came from 2 or 3 people commenting asking to do it specifically for CrossFit.
Yeah.
So let us know what you want to see and we'll try and deliver.
So if you are in your off-season athlete and you're looking for what can you do in your gym specific stuff, so we don't have sport specific program, but we do have an off-season athlete that's, so the skill level needed for the off-season athletes, there's 2 blocks with, so it's 8 weeks total, and it's just for people with it's a low skill kind of program, so
very low barrier for entry.
Yeah,
so if you're just used to going to the gym, you can pick up the program and start training.
Like it's high work capacity aspects, so it's not like maximum lift, so it's just to build your work capacity, connective tissue, some kind of muscle mass building. So there's no like power cleans, full lifts like that. It's just it's a GPP phase, so very low specificity. Okay, so that is on the. I'll just throw it up there on the screen for you to see it, and then green screen, and then come autumn, so September, October time, fits will be taking on some one-to-one spots for the real athletes to work kind of through. What can you? So
we're going to look a lot at your allocation resources like we spoke today. There'll obviously be some mental skills side of stuff in it, and then we're going to look for the athletes. This will be ideal for an athlete who has some semblance of control over maybe a third of their training volume. So people who are playing with a team and their sport specific stuff is looked after, and they're looking to do gym work, strength work, power and speed work slightly off to the side.
Yeah.
So it'll be similar to what Gurf will do with the weightlifters and powerlifters and CrossFitters, but this will be mainly for field sports athletes and kind of athletics athletes.
Yeah, so Fitz obviously has an undergrad in sports science and a master's in sports psychology. He's played sports for years, done a lot of coaching himself, so that's kind of his area of speciality, I suppose, and obviously mine would be more gym-based strength training for strength athletes, I suppose. But so September, it'll be.
It's going to be September, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the reason it's going to be September is because that's when most of the people we have on off-season blocks at the moment are going to be coming off their off-season blocks. September tends to work well as well because for a lot of our sports, and I know the States is the same, they'll tend to have an off-season block until around the end of July, start of August. Then they usually go into like a pre-season or a camp block where they do a lot of their work capacity stuff, and then the on-season stuff will usually start mid-September. So
Are you looking to take athletes on season or off season? Is it
on season?
Oh, on season.
Yeah.
That's difficult.
Yeah.
Alright, thanks for watching, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Next week we will do powerlifting and weightlifting left.
Yeah.
So
I think weightlifting.
okay, we'll do weightlifting next week. Obviously, so some of these concepts as well, like the why you should strength train for sports. We'll be doing some fatigue management indicators like HR feet. We'll touch on that. Kind of pros and cons of that. Does it work? Those kind of things. Okay, thanks for watching, guys.
Thanks, guys. That's good. Can't wait to hear what that's like with the mic.
I hope it's not shit.